Good evening. I'm Earl Butch Graves, Jr., President and CEO, Black Enterprise. It has been a year since our world changed, and it took all of 9 minutes and 29 seconds. During those chilling moments, millions across the globe were shocked, angered, and saddened as they watched the horrific sight of the deliberate execution of a Black life that mattered. The murder of George Floyd made the world take notice to the fact that Black Americans have been devalued and marginalized for far too long, not only by police violence routinely perpetrated against Black people without repercussions or accountability, but also by the ceaseless discrimination and systemic racism that permeates every aspect of American life. As such, we cannot afford to remain silent when it comes to any action that seeks to deny us our fundamental rights, diminish our dignity, or hinder our economic progress. That's why we've asked you to join us tonight for the spawning of a groundbreaking new event. To mark the ongoing racial reawakening birthed from last year's tragedy, we at Black Enterprise are staying true to our 50-year mission by using our platform to facilitate candid, no-holds-barred conversations, assembling the best minds from business, politics, civil rights, and social thought leadership for deep dives on the challenges confronting Black America and devising specific strategies to address them. I would like to officially welcome you to the launch of the Black Enterprise Economic Equity and Racial Justice Town Hall series, Closing the Wealth Gap. As the #1 Black digital media brand, reaching more than 8 million unique visitors per month, our virtual programming is like no other in that we are dissecting these issues through a business lens with a clear, intentional objective: developing solutions to drive lasting Black economic and financial empowerment. In our examination of wealth in this nation, the racial divide is staggering. At $171,000, the net worth of a typical white family is roughly 10 times greater than that of a Black family at $17,150. This enormous Black-white wealth gap and other financial measures clearly communicate the impact of generations of inequality and discrimination, as well as the continuing cycle of diminished access to opportunity. As such, it has always been my contention that if we fix the greatest divide, wealth, then Blacks will have the means to address those divides of health, education, digital, and so many others. Throughout this year, we will use this series to tackle a range of complex issues that have consistently served to impede the progress of Black America. Topics will include voter suppression, the status of wealth building, education, business development, and Black women. It is only fitting that we kick off our Town Hall series with a roundtable discussion. 1 year after George Floyd, has corporate America made good on its economic equity pledges? The announcement of corporate commitments to diversity and inclusion are not new. However, they are strangely triggered by heinous acts aimed at African Americans. This evening's discussion will review how to hold corporate America accountable for making sure that the billions of dollars pledged in the name of ending systemic racism result in real systemic change, including economic equity and wealth creation for Black people. We are extremely excited to have our five-star inaugural panel of speakers engage in this vital conversation. This evening's town hall speakers include the civil rights lawyer who has been dubbed Black America's Attorney General, Ben Crump, one of America's most accomplished business leaders, chairman of technology giant Infor, and co-chair of Black Economic Alliance, Charles Phillips, one of America's leading C-suite executives and founder of the Black Executive CMO Alliance, Jerry DeVard, 20-year global business veteran and Manulife Vice President, Talent Management, Tara John, and led by our dynamic moderator, CNN commentator, attorney, and activist, Bakari Sellers. Let me note, we invite our audience to join this important conversation through our chat feature. Please share your questions and comments. Before we get started, I would like to extend my sincere appreciation to our sponsors. We are excited to have one of the world's leading insurers, Manulife, serve as host sponsor for this evening's session, and we are extraordinarily proud to partner with the Executive Leadership Council, the preeminent global organization focused on developing Black corporate C-suite and board leaders, to also come aboard as our Town Hall series sponsor. This unique partnership serves as a testament to the power that can be realized when two leading Black institutions join forces. Now, as we begin our conversation, we will first hear remarks from Roy Gorey, President and CEO of Manulife, host sponsor of this evening's event.
Thanks, Butch. Just over a year ago, all of us were saddened and shaken by the killing of George Floyd. His death and far too many other acts of racial discrimination, violence, and injustice that came before him reinforce that systemic inequalities and discrimination are still prevalent in our society. Earlier this year in February, I was grateful to connect with Butch and Black Enterprise for a fireside chat. It was an incredibly impactful and valuable discussion, and it helped me to further understand how I and others can help create positive change. When we stand up, speak out, and take action, we send a message that racism, aggression, and violence against Black and brown communities must stop. It's been heartening to see so many voices come forward and so much positive action taken on this journey, and there's still much more to do. At Manulife, our mission is to help make decisions easier and lives better, and our values act as a guide for everything we do. Simply put, there is no better way to make lives better than taking steps to end the injustices that many of our friends, colleagues, and neighbors still experience. It's why our global team has committed to deepening our understanding of how to be an ally and build a more inclusive company. Driving change and creating a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive world is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And that's going to require our ongoing commitment, self-reflection, and sustained focus. Thank you. We're truly proud to be part of the change with you.
Hello, my name is Bakari Sellers, and I'm a CNN political commentator and former member of the South Carolina State House of Representatives. And I'm so happy to be with you guys today for this very, very important discussion. We've had many discussions throughout the past 18 months, most of them via Zoom and virtual, trying to figure out two very, very simple questions, but yet so important. How far have we come and where do we go from here? Today, I have the awesome task of working with Black Enterprise on economic equity and racial justice as a part of their larger town hall series. 1 year after George Floyd, has corporate America made good on its economic equity pledges? We've known it's been over a year since the death of George Floyd. We've lived through Ahmaud Arbery, we lived through Breonna Taylor, and even after the Chauvin trial, we've had cases like Andrew Brown and Ma'Khia Bryant. We see that this happens to be a cycle that happens over and over and over again. One of the questions I'm going to ask the August panel that we have today is, how do we break that cycle of perpetual grief that we feel in our hearts, that we have in our communities? Not only that, though, we've come off COVID and its ravaging effects on the Black community, both from a public health and economic perspective. And so we're trying to untangle all of these things as we move forward, which is why we asked that question, where do we go from here? You know, over the past year, the global unrest, the aftermath of George Floyd, major corporations have been challenged to confront systemic racism in the workplace and society as a whole. We've challenged them to step out of their corporate boundaries and into the communities they serve. The session seeks to focus on measures for Black advancement based on the series of corporate pledges to deal with past and current racial inequities. The initiatives include providing more opportunities for Black professionals in the workplace, increasing capital and procurement opportunities for Black-owned businesses, and ensuring corporate accountability to this renewed focus on diversity, equity, inclusion. The question is, have they made true on these promises? How do we continue to push them to do better? And then how do we ensure the accountability and the transparency to see that justice is actually a verb? For me personally, as a father to twins and a 16-year-old daughter, this issue hits home, like many of us watching. We want to make sure that our children don't have to end up like George Floyd. And so my heart goes out, and we're giving words today. We're actually living for today people like Botham Jean. We're giving words. We're living for people like Eric Gardner. We're giving words, and we're living for all of those who are not with us today because of state-sanctioned violence. And we're asking, how do we go forward? And how do we go forward together? I want to introduce our panel because we have an amazing panel. First, we have Jerry DeVard, who sits on a number of boards herself, but even more importantly, is the founder of the Black Executive CMO Alliance. And she does God's work. She goes out there and works with their hands and tries to cultivate and build up new Black corporate execs, particularly in the realm of marketing and development. And she's going to be with us today to give us her perspective. We also have Ben Crump, who is one of my good friends, who's always working, no days off, except Sunday mornings. If you ever want to find Ben on a Sunday morning, he's always in church with his beautiful wife and daughter in Tallahassee. But Al Sharpton has adorned him Black America's Attorney General. I think that title fits him perfectly. He'll be joining us because his boots are always on the ground. We have Charles Phillips, who is a great friend of mine. I actually am one of the advisors to the BEA, or the Black Economic Alliance. Charles Phillips, along with Tony Coles, have taken this organization and they've taken their experience in building corporations and working with the BEA to have a public policy footprint, but also, bridge that gap between Black corporate America and grassroots. And they do it so well. Charles has been dynamic on the forefront of working in various administrations, working with various elected officials to push policy and initiatives that directly improve and enhance the life of Black folk, particularly Black folk in corporate America. And last but not least, we have Tara John joining us today. She is a dynamic individual who literally sits in a C-suite today. She's the Vice President of Talent Management at Manulife. And so I want to welcome everybody to the panel together today as we discuss 1 year since George Floyd, as we talk about these corporate promises that were made. And we ask ourselves two larger questions, which are how far have we come and where do we go from here? Welcome to this amazing panel. We want to jump right in and have this discussion. May 25th marked 1 year since the death of George Floyd. And so I just want to open up the panel by having them tell me a little bit about themselves, but see, as we ask two very specific questions, how far have we come and where do we go from here? But talk about what has happened over that last year. Have we seen transformative change? What are some of the things that we need to do? I just want a 50,000 foot view as we introduce ourselves to the viewers and listeners today. And I'm gonna start with you, Jerry.
Well, thank you, Bakari. Jerry DeVard. I am a CMO marketer, founder of the Black Executive CMO Alliance, which was really created to kind of take advantage of the opportunity to create and present more African Americans that are sitting at the top of the houses in marketing in some amazing companies. I really got tired of the issue and conversation being around supply when really it's about demand. And when you look at the fact that only 3% of chief marketing officers are Black, and it's been that way for 3 years, I said, enough's enough. How do we pay it forward? How do we pay it back? So that more young Black marketing professionals can become chief marketing officers. And by giving them the playbook, that this is how you overcome adversity, understand and know that the rules are stacked against you, that you don't start at the same playing field, all the things we know. But being able to see and understand that they have what they need in order to succeed. And all they have to do is really reach within themselves and understand that you can overcome. Even if you trip, you're gonna get back up and you can overcome adversity, because we all have, but sometimes you think you have to be perfect. When you ask that question about, what's happened over the past year, and it's a great question, because in some ways there's been a lot of progress. And I say that, and I'm ready for panelists to disagree with me, but I think we'd all agree that it's not enough. It's never enough. And based upon whatever you read, whatever statistics you've seen, there's been upwards of $60 billion that has been pledged by companies and CEOs about creating change. And the question becomes, who's tracking that? What's the transparency that companies have when you see this is what I've spent? I think we've made progress, though, in terms of things like these diversity audits that people are doing, where you actually can talk about the representation, because before last year, that was kind of a secret and people weren't held accountable for that. So I think there's been progress in that. I also think that the progress has been in the conversation, that we're now having conversations that before no one wanted to talk about, or more arrogantly, people felt that we'd done enough. CEOs felt that they'd done enough. We weren't talking about the consequences of not having done enough. So in that regard, I think we've had progress, but there's a lot more to do.
That's a great segue. And I want to talk about the C-suite and some of those things that you've seen from the corporate America perch. There's no better way to get to that than individuals who are actually there. So I want to go with Charles and Ms. John. Let's lay it out. You guys see it every single day from your perch. Talk about the last year. She mentioned that $60 billion. I think the money's all good, but I also am someone who says that if you don't change your corporate culture, if you're just talking about the illusion of inclusion, what does it really mean? So am I looking at this from the right perspective, and how do we hold these individuals accountable?
So I could take that, Bakari. I could start, and I couldn't agree with you more. So Tara John, I'm Vice President of Talent Management at Manulife. So I'm accountable for assessments, talent review, and leadership development for the organization. And I think building on what you've said and what we've heard previously, well, some of the things that we're finding is what has happened in the past year is that organizations start to do some self-reflection and think about what have they said publicly with respect to DEI. And a lot of the work that they're doing focused on one segment. And a lot of that the primary focus on that was for gender. And when you looked at some of the work that was happening, it didn't touch intersectionality. And so we weren't seeing the impact of Black women. We weren't seeing the impact of women of color. We weren't seeing the impact on women with disabilities. It was primarily white women that were benefiting from some of the work that was happening. And so as organizations were responding and being really declarative about commitments that they're making, they're realizing it has to be an and. It can't just be one group at the expense of another. And I think when we realized what was happening, we were realizing it's taking much more time to actually get there. It is going to be a journey. There's a lot of work that needs to happen. The journey is not going to be linear, but we're having more robust conversations right now. We're also seeing CEOs, and I could talk about this from a Manulife perspective. Our CEOs are sitting at the table and holding accountability for DEI. They're co-sponsoring, just like Roy Gory is at Manulife, co-sponsoring DEI councils. And so they're at the table, not just discounting this, not just passing it on to HR or to the DEI team to lead. They need to be held accountable for driving these business results like it's any other business mechanism that they're tracking.
Charles, I mean, from your perch, you have a unique role because you kind of see how you also intersect with the public policy space as well at the BEA, but you come from a great corporate background as well. Over the last year, what are some of the changes that you've seen? If we were to say, how far have we come? How would you answer that question from a corporate perch?
Yeah, sure. I've been a technology executive most of my career, president of Oracle, CEO of M4, and I'm on the board of American Express and Viacom CBS, so I kind of see different touch points. And it's been remarkable over the last year, kind of the change in the dialogue. So I would say before George Floyd, it was something of a checkbox that you had to at least acknowledge, but you didn't spend a lot of time on for most CEOs. And what's changed now, I give the credit to employees. Employees put the pressures on their CEOs, especially in tech where you need those employees. They're hard to replace. And they want purpose and they had values. And my theory is they've lost faith in most other institutions. So they don't have the universities anymore. They're out of school. They don't go to church anymore. They don't believe in government anymore. The one purpose that they do get is from their company. They want you to take a stand. So these CEOs didn't have much choice because employees can work somewhere else, especially in tech, they have choices. And so they were pushed into this, but now that they're there, they're trying to figure it out. I get calls literally every week of CEOs who are struggling. What should I say? What I shouldn't say? Myself and Ken Frazier and Ken Chenault were asked to speak to the Business Council, which is the top 200, kind of CEOs in the country. That was the main question. Can you guys come on and talk about kind of how can we make a difference? And so what we did was focus them on jobs. So like, you guys can't really solve police injustice, and a lot of other things that you don't know anything about, but you can hire people. So we got them to commit to hiring 1 million Black people over the next 10 years. And the project's called 110, and they committed to putting $100 million a year into that over the next 10 years. And so that's something tangible they could do. We can hold them accountable for. You either hire the people or you're dead. You put the money in or you're dead. And so we're trying to find ways to hold people accountable. Is if you're really committed and you're doing this and you mean what you say, show me by hiring some Black people.
I mean, that's a great answer. I mean, Ben, you and I do this work on the ground. You're slightly older than I, so you've been doing it a little bit longer.
You're on the same age. Come on.
You've been doing it a little bit. Ben showed you that black don't crack. You've been doing it a little bit longer than I. But one of the things, Ben, that we oftentimes find ourselves talking about, I think that one of the most unique conversations I've ever had was with you, Harry Daniels, and myself on the way to the funeral for Andrew Brown. And you talked about that feeling, how you just never get used to that feeling of going to another funeral. How do we break this cycle? It's been a year, but how do we break this cycle of the perpetual state of grieving? And let me give you this illustration, Ben. We have not had any political change in this country that was absent Black blood flowing in the street. You wouldn't have had the Voting Rights Act or the Civil Rights Act without the 1960s, Edmund Pettus Bridge, et cetera. You wouldn't have had the Fair Housing Act of 68 without the assassination of King. You don't have the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act without the death of George Floyd. How do we make that progress and get corporations to help us push for that progress without us having to pay what Abraham Lincoln called the last full measure of devotion? Man, I channeled Don Lemon or Anderson Cooper with that question. That was a good one right there, Ben. Let's see if you can flesh that out for me a little bit.
That was layered, Bakari. Everybody else got simple questions. But no, it is good to have this conversation, especially with these corporate titans, because I do believe when we think about, Bakari, what has changed in the last year, but more importantly, what you asked, how do we prevent this from continuing to happen, seem like every week? I mean, it's hashtag after hashtag of Black people being killed unjustly by the police who are supposed to protect and serve them. And what I believe is we have to increase the value of Black life, point blank, period. Whether that is in these police excessive use of force cases, or whether that's in corporate America, or whether that's in our communities that represent growth for corporations and doing business. They're underserved now. We have to use moments like George Floyd, where America is finally ready, because you and I have often talked, to have this racial reckoning that they have long ignored. They just always would shy away from the conversation, where it was very difficult to look away from the George Floyd video. Now, we're talking about it to Jerry, Charles, and Tara's point, but the question is, will we act? You know, it's one thing to talk, but will you do something about it? We haven't had meaningful police reform in America in 57 years. And I am so concerned, and God knows you know this, Bakari, your two home senators is the key. to making this George Floyd Justice Act finally pass with some substance and not be just rhetoric, but can actually prevent us seeing another Breonna Taylor or another Jacob Blake Jr. or where Jerry lives, Corey Jones, where Charles lives, Eric Gardner, where Terry is near her, Daniel Prude in Rochester. So everywhere in America, you see these killings keep happening. And this is after George Floyd. And so have we made progress? Absolutely. Do we have a long way to go? Absolutely. But the only way we can prevent them is we gotta have not just us, but our white brothers and sisters, not just the civil rights leaders, but the corporate leaders. We all have to act, y'all. We have to act. If we lose this moment, we may never get another moment like this for another half a century. And the last thing I will say on this question, Bakari, is, and I know I'm preaching to a different audience, but we have to look and be intentional to have these conversations in rooms that they don't often like to talk about this stuff. I know when I am asked about George Floyd, I try to be very honest. I say every Black person in America who looks at that video, we say, but by the grace of God. That could be my brother, my father, my husband, me. Our white brothers and sisters look at the video and they say, oh my God, how can a person do that to another human being? But they never, ever think that could be them. And that's why we have to have these conversations.
Ms. John and Ms. DeVard, let me just be, you guys deal with people either in your own companies or training them up to be in these corporate suites. What do you say to people, to answer Charles's question and how he went in front of that corporate council, but what do you say to individuals who come to you and say, one, should we be involved in social justice issues outside of just giving money? And two, how do we actually implement concrete steps? What do you say to those individuals who want to get involved but want to know which way to go?
Or do you want to, or?
Just jump.
Yeah. So, do you want to get involved? I don't think you have a choice. See, this is the issue. When you think about the murder of George Floyd and all of the companies and CEOs that came out with their intention to either spend money or commit or hire or invest or improve, fill in the blank. There was a lot of that conversation. And so when you think about, all right, well, what happened to that? Because Ben talked about intention. Intention sometimes can show up as rhetoric because no CEO gets to keep their job when they intended to increase shareholder value, when they intended to increase EPS, where they intended to meet their earnings forecast. You don't get to stick around. But somehow you get to retain your job when year after year, quarter after quarter, your numbers don't improve when it comes to representation. And I'm not going to say of minorities, I'm going to say of Black professionals, of Black people in your organization. So I think that the conversation is now about, and I'll talk to you about, individuals versus companies, but the accountability and the consequences. It's accountability and consequences. Who's measuring, who's asking the questions in the organization? Are we keeping our commitments or is it just hollow? And then, all right, if you're accountable for it, then what are the consequences when you don't perform? So I'm happy to say that, two of the corporate boards that I serve on, that there are consequences, that it is baked into incentive, it is baked into your pay, it is baked into your performance and evaluation, your achievement of goals of representation. When you don't have accountability and consequences, then over and over, the same thing happens. And I also think too, that the change that we have to make, some of it is evolutionary, but a lot of it is revolutionary. A lot of it has to change because what you're doing is not working. And we all know the definition of doing the same thing and expecting a different result. So I ask the questions in the boardroom that get us to examine where we are and what we need to do. As an executive, the thing that I did was when I walked into the boardroom as an operating executive, I knew that I wasn't just representing myself, but there were a lot of people outside the door that I had to speak up, I had to speak for and about. And those conversations are very, very uncomfortable, but you have to have them. And I would say that more companies are having those conversations led by people that don't necessarily look like me, because the expectation is, well, of course you're going to talk about that, but allyship is important, but you also have to take the responsibility to say, I'm going to ask the question, I'm going to lean into the discomfort of it, and I'm also going to be around to say that you haven't held up to what you said you were going to do.
Ms. John?
I think employees are watching, our customers are watching, our partners are watching. So I don't think there is any way that an organization or the leaders within the organization can stand back. And it's not good enough to just be an ally without putting your personal reputation behind it and showing your commitment to driving this. I think it is a challenge, and we're having those conversations that didn't take place in the past because people are tired and they're hurt and they're not seeing movement from their company to align to their personal values, and they're walking away. We've seen increase in resignations as people are not seeing that their companies align to their personal values or aligning to their purpose. And so companies are being dissected for the words that they're using, dissected by the commitments and that they're putting out there. And not only are they being tracked internally, but they're being tracked by the market, to your point, in terms of how they're tracking their quarterly results, just like they could track what their customers are saying. And so there's no longer an option to step away and say you're not going to do anything. It's too risky not to. And it's at the expense of the employees and the communities in which we operate.
Mr. Phillips, one of your unique roles is you have, amongst a number of them, is with the BEA, and you guys have created some unique partnerships with Bank of America, with Wells Fargo, with the greatest HBCU in the country, known as Morehouse College. I always have to throw that plug out there for my alma mater. But talk about the evolution of those partnerships. Is this something new that you're beginning to see more, where you're creating these entrepreneurship funds? That's the first part of the question. And the second part is something that you mentioned, which is accountability. Are you seeing, and I think that Ms. DeVard actually brought it up earlier, but are you seeing these dollars and a change in behavior throughout the pipeline? Are you seeing procurement spend? Are you seeing corporations, actually doing the things that they said they were going to do a year ago? Because it has been a year. And so the question is, where are we now? I mean, has this actually been coming to fruition?
Good question. So the Black Economic Alliance, which I'm co-chair of, was founded by about 70 business executives. And the reason we did that, Black business executives, was to take some of our training we've run in business and see how we can apply that in the Black community to create jobs and wealth and wages. And what we found out over time is a lot of businesses just do not understand what to do next. Even if they wanted to help, they don't understand what are best practices. They haven't focused on this problem. Businesses have a trouble executing on anything if there isn't a playbook and if you can't measure it. That's how they're used to running their business. So part of what we're trying to do is give them those playbooks. Here's something you can do. Here's how you measure yourself. You have to have transparency, just like anything in your business. If you're not publishing things and holding yourself accountable, nothing's going to happen. And so we've been pushing them for things like, for instance, one example we gave them was for ISS, which is Institutional Shareholder Services. They tell people how to vote on proxies. Basically, do I want to replace this board of directors or not? And for years, they've been saying, vote against any board of directors if they don't have enough women on them. They've never done that for Black people. So we're giving them ideas like that. It's like, you understand what you did for women, do this for Black people. So I do think people are kind of groping and trying to find out how to do this better. On the Center for Black Entrepreneurship, that was a project that started with some VCs that called me. This was, again, right after George Floyd. About 20 VCs in California said, we'd love to help Black people, but we don't see any Black entrepreneurs. There's no pipeline. It's not like we don't want to work with you guys, but we can't create entrepreneurs out of thin air. They just don't exist. And my response was, these are guys I've known for years. I go, that's what you do for a living. You build entrepreneurs. That's your VC, your venture capitalist. So you just happen to be around white kids and not Black kids. So you take these young kids, you teach them how to build networks, how to recruit people, how to build a product, all the stuff you do on business building. You could do that with Black people. They have ideas, they have aptitude, they just don't have access to you and capital. And so the idea was to get these VCs who are normally in California to set up shop on the campus of Morehouse and Spelman. And so fast forward 6 months later, we've raised $50 million for the project to hire faculty and tenured professors, and another $50 million in a fund to invest in the ideas that the kids come up with. So we're starting with Morehouse and Spelman. We're going to add other HBCUs over time and eventually online, so you don't have to be a student. But the idea is, let's take people who know how to build businesses, put them around Black people who have great ideas, who know their communities and want to build a business. They just don't have access. So we're working on that right now.
Thank you for all your efforts so far and everything that you will be doing. That's innovative. And I think that that's the type of things we need to be done to build this pipeline and create wealth. Because one of the things that we have to do a better job of in our own communities is how do we create wealth? Ben, you get invited to speak to these corporations a lot now in these large groups right now. What are you telling these CEOs? What are you telling these corporations about how they can get involved and what they need to do beyond just, writing a check for $100,000 to, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund? Now that's great. Now we'll take the money, but what more? And what are you telling these individuals?
Thank you, Bakari. And I want to say thank you to what Charles and others did with the BEA in Georgia when they said that based on you trying to suppress the votes in our community, we're going to take an affirmative action. And I think that's what I try to tell these corporations who invite me, because I'm very honest, because I'm Ben Crump, whether I'm on TV or whether we talking on the phone. We believe completely in what we say. We're unapologetic in our defense of Black life and Black liberty and Black humanity. And so when you get a chance to speak truth to power, I always believe you have to do it. Now, I'm not doing it to try to be antagonistic to them, but shame on me if I get the opportunity to speak to them and I don't tell the truth about the fact that, and Butch Graves helped me with this a lot too. We have to say things about, you talk about financial literacy for our community. Well, Black people can read and write and learn just as good as anybody else. What we need is financial empowerment. You need to give us access to capital. You need to do for us what you do for the white community. We don't need a handout. All we need is a hand up. And once we get up, we can do just fine, and that's what we have to continue to say over and over again. And the other thing I always say, to go back to that point I made about George Floyd, and I think everybody on the panel said it, they have no idea, Bakari, our reality. They just don't understand it. I'll say this one little thing, and it gets deep when we have these fireside chats. I say in states like Florida, Tennessee, and Texas, 1 out of every 5 Black men are labeled as convicted felons. And the experts opine, if this trend continues in the next 25 years, 1 out of every 3 Black men will be labeled as a convicted felon. And many of the states are just like these 3 states. And I say, I want you to try to imagine for me, if you would, that you are a parent of a Black male child and that you are have a Black male nephew and you have a Black male cousin, and you try to imagine them around the age of 5, 6, or 7 years old. And in your mind's eye, you try to imagine them playing as children often do. And just try to imagine in your mind, as you observe them, which one of these 3 little Black boys with your blood running through their veins in the next 10 to 20 years will be labeled a convicted felon and live a permanent underclass citizen in America. and you try to have that stark reality and say, a lot of your African-American employees have family members. It doesn't matter how talented they are, how resourceful they are. There's a system in America that will target them and try to label them as having no redeeming qualities for society, having nothing to contribute. And so you have to acknowledge that this is not just an issue for that community, but it affects your business as well in the long run. So let's figure out how to make America be America for everybody so it can help your corporation grow too. And don't tell me that you don't look at these issues and say, we can't do anything about it. Because the reality is you can. The question is, will you? And those are the kind of conversations we have.
I'm thankful. I thought you were going to say you want to figure out how to make America great again. I didn't know what you with that, Ben. I'm glad you veered off. Let me ask you one more question, Ben, before I go to Ms. DeVard. I want to talk to her about corporate board diversity and if we've seen any, if we're beginning to see some of that. But Ben, you're focused a lot on the policy of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. I would be remiss with all of these people watching if you didn't tell them a little bit about what that does. And then are you seeing any corporations like you did in Georgia with voting rights? Are you seeing corporations behind you helping to push the passage of that piece of legislation?
Now, that's an excellent question, Bakari. And Bakari and I mean, we talk late at night, early in the morning, because you have to understand this legislation is very impactful on many levels. But when you think about how much money goes into policing in America, and even more how much money goes into criminal justice in America, you know, every move is calculated. Nothing happens by happenstance. They may get emotional, but then they start thinking about the bottom line. And they start saying, well, you know, if we start limiting the police and what they can do, it stops this school to prison pipeline, this prison industrial complex. And so we have to literally, because as we talk so often, we have to try to have them expand their thinking, to reimagine a better world where Black and brown people not being in the system is actually beneficial to them making money, to their corporate aspirations. And so with the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, just to run down on what it really is, it's about holding police officers accountable. And it's not taking away from their rights to go to court. But all we're saying is we want the families of those Black people who we believe have been killed unjustly to have their day in court too. And that's that whole qualified immunity thing where over 95% of the cases when they kill Black people are dismissed automatically. And people say, well, how can it be? It's the intellectual justification of discrimination. And it not only happens in the courtrooms, it happens in corporations every day. It happens in every aspect of society. It happens on Wall Street, Charles. They come up with technical reasons to justify the discrimination because the worst thing they ever want to be acknowledged because is as a racist. They will dance all around it. They say it's not because they were Black. They come up with other reasons. It's because, oh, that community there, we don't think that people can afford our products. You know, they come up with all these technical reasons. And we have to keep telling them that, no, look at the Black dollar, how it spends. And then to finish your point, Breonna Taylor, No Not Warrant Act is in the George Floyd where they can't just bust in Black people doors, violating the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. Obviously, dealing with the body camera videos. The only difference between Rodney King 30 years ago and George Floyd is the improvement in the quality of technology. You know, that's it. And so we want those officers to have to turn on their body cameras when they have interactions with us. And that's good, I think, in the tech industry, Charles, because it opens up an entire new stream of revenue. They all got to have body cameras. Then they all got to store those videos somewhere. They got to be able to get them for court and for administrative proceedings. I mean, it's a whole tech industry that comes from just this here. So I think that's how we win, Bakari, on making this happen and getting help from our corporate allies. And it has been happening. A lot of people in the Silicon Valley have been pushing hard for George Floyd. And I don't know, Bakari Sellers, if it's because they care so much about George Floyd and others who look like George Floyd, but they see the financial money to be made from making these laws. Hopefully I answered your question. I try to do it short, Bakari.
Yeah, I know, Deacon Crump. Well, I know.
Sorry, if I may, I just want to
sure.
pick up on something you said, because the case of making this kind of a business case for people to do this is actually something smart to do. So that was one of the arguments we used when we got these companies to sign up for hiring 1 million Black people. The first thing we told them is like, these are your future customers. You want them to have money. You want them to have disposable income. You want them buying homes. So whether you like it or not, the demographics are changing. You want them in a position to buy your products. And then secondly, these are your future employees. So you're going to need to invest. You might as well wake up now and start doing this. And then lastly, we told them, look at what's happening. You know, the demographics are changing. The population is aging. Immigration is constrained by what Trump did. We still haven't fixed that yet. You have to train the people who are here. And who are those? They're going to increasingly be people of color. Accept that. And like from a business perspective, it makes sense to make this investment. And the last point we told them, like, you guys are all complaining about, you know, welfare and entitlements and taxes, the things the government spends. Guess what? If everybody has jobs and they're working and owning their homes, they consume a lot less entitlement spending. So you can fix it. Any way you look at it, this is good for you.
Ms. John, Mr. Var, did you all, this is a town hall, so you please jump in.
Yeah, no, I'm a big believer in data. Bakari, you talked about being a Morehouse grad, so this is my opportunity to talk about being a Spelman grad and being an economics major and being able to, being taught that numbers matter. And so let's talk about the numbers. Like when you think about the conversations we're having and why we're having them, it is because of the numbers. So you look at the representation of Black senior executives in corporate America, that is a paltry 3%. When you look at the fact that since the Fortune 500 was started back in 1953 and 1,800 CEOs have become a member of that, only 19 of them have been Black. You look at the COVID statistics and you say, okay, about 75,000, whites have died. Well, it's double that for Blacks. Everywhere you look, there is a statistic, a number that indicates that there is, when everyone else is sick, we are dying. And so you think about what that means and the implications for that and the kind of conversations you have to have. So Bakari, earlier you were talking about, you were going to talk about the boardroom. And so the Executive Leadership Council, ELC, which I'm a proud member of, is going to be releasing a study about representation along with Deloitte around Blacks in the boardroom. And the numbers are, again, abysmal. The lion's share of seats are still going to whites and predominantly white males. In the Fortune 500, about 8% of board directors are Black. In the Fortune 100, about 12%, so a little better, but low. And there's still, to this day, there are boards that have all white males. There are boards that have no Black representation. And so when you start to have that conversation, much like Charles was talking about the fact that employees are making this conversation much more urgent and much more that you can't ignore it, the question becomes, where are customers? And a lot of shareholder organizations are now starting to call that out and making it a requirement that you report on that. But still, in 2021, where I'm sure none of these organizations are only selling to white customers and white consumers, so how is that okay to not have the voice in the room that is representing the needs and the voice of the customer against a broad spectrum of individuals? So again, when you think about where we are and how long it's taken, the 1619 Project, 500 years ago of formal and informal slavery, but guess what? There was enslavement before 1619. So when you think about the entrenched behavior and biases and assumptions and stereotypes and things that we've had to overcome, this journey is getting better, because of the conversation, because of the measurement, because of what I'm hoping will be the accountability and the consequences, and because people are talking about it and saying that no more, that time's up on you not being able to affect this change. And I keep saying this, that everyone, a lot of organizations and people said that this was a supply problem, but it is a demand problem. You have to look within your organization, look within your companies, and say, what is the representation that is missing? And how can I now affect those changes that are going to be measured in a way that is going to make a difference? It's not the town hall, it's not the ad, it's not the commitments, it's the actual fact.
Ms. John, I wanted to talk to you about the DEI space, which you know like the back of your hand, and you do so much work in that space. Ms. John, Mr. Vard, and Mr. Phillips, how do we build that pipeline to the C-suite, and how do we build that pipeline to the boardroom? Because, I see a lot of the same names, even with all due respect to my friend Charles, I see a lot of the same names on board after board after board, and it doesn't seem to be, the press refresh and have this new opportunity and that new opportunity, because it's just hard to get there. We don't have those relationships. So Ms. John, if you could talk about DEI, and you can begin to answer that question on the pipeline to the C-suite and the boardroom. And then I would like if Mr. Vard and Mr. Phillips both chime in on that.
I'd love to.
Yeah, absolutely. On the DEI front, and I'm going to build a bit on what Jerry was saying, one of the critical pieces is on data, right? We have to be tracking the representation that exists across the organization. Again, it has to be accurate data. We have to actually be intentional and explain to employees why it's important that we're collecting this data. A lot of companies use the terminology "count me in," where we ask employees to self-disclose their race and their gender as examples. And we need that information so we can track and really build intentional DEI programs to support the development of people across the board. And I think the challenge is, without the data, you can't set the baseline with which you're going to be building and driving solutions. And it allows you to make incremental changes. As I mentioned earlier, the DEI journey is something that's going to take a while, and it actually will have bumps in the roads. And a lot of organizations will need to take a step back as they're moving forward. And the ability for them to move forward and advance what they're doing is as having the numbers that they could track. They could look at their representation all the way down the organization across every level, so that they can see when they're making advancements, when they make these public commitments about the representation that they're going to have at various levels and the growth that they're going to actually see. With the data, they're able to drive that. And so I'm seeing a lot of more companies do that. We've done that. We've been really intentional about it. And I think the other nuance when it comes to DEI is that it's an area where companies don't necessarily have to solely think about each other as competitors. It is, how do we actually raise the waterline across all of your organizations as a whole, and raise and create greater awareness and create better opportunities for the community as a whole, as we're looking at the progression of talent from all diverse segments, especially Black talent, as they're moving up across and moving around organizations. And I think there's conversations that are happening at CEO levels across HR tables and with the heads of diversity for many organizations, so that we're driving this important work, because it's a way for us to all succeed collectively. On the talent front, and what we could be doing more deliberately, I would say we need to look at how we're bringing in talent, how we're developing while they're here, and in terms of how we're actually progressing them through the organization. And so no longer is an excuse to say, as Charles mentioned earlier, that the talent does not exist. We need to hold our recruiters accountable. We need to hold our business leaders accountable for saying that they want diversity in the slates, and thinking about where do they go out to get the talent, whether it's schools that they're partnering with, various associations, where are they going to find the talent? Because we all know that the talent exists. And when we think about internal mobility and how we're supporting people as they're developing across the organization, work is changing. Skills can be a great equalizer. And so how are we ensuring that we're giving everybody the same opportunities to develop their skill sets, and so they can just transition from one job to another, and they can appreciate their career trajectory. And I would say, as you move across in the more senior levels of the organization, a lot of us can look at succession slates and see that there's no diversity there. And so we need to be more intentional. Are we going to be thinking about holding roles until we have diverse candidates that are in that role? and looking down the organization when we're assessing our talent, because we know that there's a higher proportion of diverse talent and Black talent at lower levels of the organization. How we bring those people up by being really intentional in our processes and looking at our systems and addressing talent issues so that we're seeing the movement of talent and being more intentional about having and raising that pipeline so that there's no excuse anymore.
I love when you speak because you stress the word intentional. You know, a lot of things and a lot of times we have these discussions and people just want to have these diversity panels and say DEI to say it. But we're going to get back to some of the things you're doing in your job because I appreciate the 3 pillars at your corporation. And I want to talk a little bit about those, but being intentional. How do we be intentional, Mr. Phillips and Mr. Vard, about this pipeline? You know, maybe one day Ben Crump wants to sit on a corporate board one day. How do we build that pipeline, and how are we intentional about both the C-suite, which you work with so frequently, Mr. Vard, and also the boardroom?
Well, I think that, you know, again, back to the data and back to, you know, being an economics major and being a proud Spelman grad, you know, and unemployment is about 6%. It's double that for Blacks, right? And so, yeah, things that you're doing to try and give people a decent living wage helps. But it really is about how do you prepare people to assume greater responsibility when sometimes they don't see people that look like them and believe it can happen. But Carl, you're absolutely right. You talked about the fact that the recycling of, you know, one person, I'll get 5 calls, you know, to be on a board rather than calling 5 people. But I can honestly say that it's changing, right? It is changing because we are Blacks to sit on corporate boards. The calls and the demand is really growing. And I can tell you that as I have given names of individuals for companies to call, for search firms to call, they're actually getting the calls and they're getting placed more so than at a time than I've ever seen before. Is it enough? No, but I can honestly say it's progress. And again, I keep saying that if my fellow panelists disagree with me, I'm happy to see that, but I see the progress there. And I also think about when I formed and launched the Black Executive CMO Alliance, the number of calls that I have gotten from people that say, look, can you give me the names of people that can serve on the board, that can take this role, that can help us? And I say, we're not a search firm. We were not built or organized to be a search firm, to fill jobs or to place people in jobs. What we are about is elevating the profession of marketing, elevating senior executives, and elevating that opportunity to show people that are coming up that they can have that role. So the things that are important to me are when someone calls me, I say, go to our website, blackexec.com. It's not a plug, honestly. It really is a place where we're showcasing all 28 of these amazing leaders. And you tell me that you can't find the profile of someone that can fit, that can fill that board seat, that can fill that role. I don't have to be the introduction, but part of what we do is we want to share, learn, elevate, and pay it forward. Elevating individuals, sharing amongst ourselves, learning from each other, but paying it forward. And the pay it forward piece is when you reach people that are starting out their careers. First of all, when you're graduating from school and seeing people that look like you, that are succeeding, where you can say, yes, I can do that. When you're starting off your career and you can say, oh, I tripped, I bumped, but I know I can overcome that. When you are rising to your mid-level manager and then the pre-C-suite, what I'm looking to do is build those mentoring, coaching relationships where you can have a conversation with someone that has been where you are. And we share warts and all, our successes, our failures, and how we've been able to overcome that. And that's really important. And then the last thing I want to say is that this really is more so than ever, we are having conversations where people can be vulnerable, where CEOs and leaders can say, can I get your help? I really want to hear from you. I said that many of us, during the last year were tapped on the shoulder to be the chief diversity officer because we were the most senior Black in the organization and someone needed to talk to you about what was going on, whether or not we were prepared or not. But what has to happen is that those conversations continue because we have to be able to have the conversation in a way that is not threatening, that is building on what it is you need to do. And we also, my last thing is that we as Blacks, we have to stop saying that somebody ought to, and we have to say, what are we doing? I look sometimes at some of our Black leaders and I say, Who looks like you that reports to you? What does your management team look like? What do your direct reports look like? Stop pointing the finger at somebody else when you haven't done the work that needs to be done. And so if we hold ourselves accountable and hold ourselves to the mirror, we can then work with our colleagues in the boardroom, outside of the boardroom, to help them affect the change that I think genuinely many of them want to do.
You know, Mr. Vard, I got this thing in my legal profession that we look around and some of these people are filing discrimination suits and all of these things, and then they hire white lawyers because they think that their ice is colder than ours. And so we have to do a better job of taking ownership of our own kind of life cycle. Mr. Phillips, you sit on these boards, and I wasn't singling you out by any stretch, but I do, you know, there are young people watching who want to be like you. And so the question is, how do we build those pipelines? And I say that with all ounce of humility that I can. How can someone be the next Charles Phillips and be in the C-suite or be on these corporate boards? I think that's an important question for young people watching.
Yeah, that's a good question, just building on what Jerry said. So one of the things that BA did was get together some of the existing Black directors. So we had about 15 of us that were getting inundated with calls about who can I put on a board who's Black. So instead of us trying to do this on our own, we got together and put together a list of about 200 names of up and coming Black people who should be on boards. And the important point is to use our networks. Secondly, we can vouch for them, because the problem is a lot of these boards, they want someone who's already been a CEO or a CFO. Okay, well, you can't put that constraint on it because you haven't allowed people to become CEOs and CFOs. And so it's a chicken and the egg. We'll never get there. So there are people who can add value with other titles. Trust us, we will vouch for them, and we'll provide some board coaching for them as well. And so that actually has been working pretty well. I've just in the last probably 3 weeks, I put 2 Black women on boards. So that network is kind of build a network on top of that. So I think that's a model that we can use, because there's enough of us now that sit on boards if we get organized. And I've sent that list to literally 3 or 4 search firms as well. So they have the list. It's not proprietary, but we keep updating it as well. So sometimes you just got to get operational and go to the detail and be tactical and just get stuff done. So we're doing that as well. But in all of this, I don't want to get lost what government can be doing, going back to BA. So these cities, these mayors need to be doing more. So I grew up in Atlanta. I was in high school there and watched Maynard Jackson, what he did. When he said, there will be no new airport unless I see people who look like me getting these contracts. And I live in New York now, where we have a $22 billion procurement budget, and less than 3% of that goes to Black firms. And no one asks, even the white firms that win, how many Black employees that they have. And so if you don't force that so these companies can get bonded and so they can be prime contractors and get a credit history so they can borrow, they will always be small companies. A lot of white companies get started that way with government contracts, and then they branch out to the commercial sector. So even some cities with Black mayors aren't doing this. So I just don't want that piece to get lost in here. There's stuff we could be doing now. Now that we have more Black mayors, they should be operationalizing this as well.
I mean, not just you use the icon, Maynard Jackson. I'll also throw out Marion Barry and the work that he did with government contracts as the mayor of the great chocolate city, Washington, D.C. Ben, you deal in a lot of, I think that people don't know the work that you do day in and day out. People just a lot of times see you where you have to stand with and lift up families after they've lost a loved one, but you also handle some large scale discrimination cases. You handle some environmental injustice cases. Many people don't know that Ben was one of the lead attorneys in the Flint water crisis, and they are still going out and seeking justice from certain entities. So talk about from your perch, what you've been seeing, and have you been seeing a rise in these discrimination cases when individuals come to talk to you about corporate culture? What do you tell them about? I mean, because you're in the weeds. And so talk about what are some of the things that you're seeing and some of the things that you're telling them as well to stave off having Ben Crump sign the back page of an 18-page complaint against their company or corporation.
Now, Bakari, that is one of the things that we don't talk about enough as Black executives too, about this rampant discrimination that we see happening at the lower and middle management, I would say. But after the last administration, I have never got as many calls as we've gotten from Black executives saying that they were passed over for promotions or that they were not given bonuses and all types of things, because I think the last administration made it in vogue to say things that you probably were taught not to say, but you just felt emboldened to do them. And I'll say this because it was very interesting talking to some of these individuals who were at the tables when other uh, marginalized people of color were alleging discrimination, and they didn't do anything to help them. And it's so ironic that now the tables turn and they were the ones facing the microaggressions. And so we have saw us bringing claims against many banks in America. And the reason why we're able to do these things now is those executives that were being discriminated against are now sharing with us where the bodies are buried. And so now we're having conversations with them where we know what's going on, how you continue to figure out how to deny us access to capital, to deny us promotions and so forth. And it's very important that we don't wait until it happens to you. When you see it happening to another person of color, you should say something. Either if you don't use the influence that you have, I think it's like Harry Belafonte told Trayvon Martin, parents, and I at the NAACP Image Awards. What good is it having influence if you don't use it when it matters most? I mean, you got the influence and you sitting up there looking at it and you don't say anything. Well, shame on you, because God blessed you for a reason to be in these positions, and you have to do something with those blessings to help others. And the second thing with these class actions and such, what we're seeing now more than ever, maybe it's because of George Floyd and this racial reckoning, whether it's litigation with these environmental racism cases where you have all these chemical companies and different corporations, they're talking to us about things that President Obama tried so hard to get them to do, to look at different ways, even though it's cheap land in the minority communities. But how do we have it where we can try to be good corporate neighbors, since we're going to be in these minority communities that often don't have a voice? What can we do not to completely take advantage of them? And the conversations have to start with people like we have here, people who will watch Black Enterprise, because if we don't say it, it won't be said in the world. And I mean, there's a Flint, Bakari, in every state in America. There is the talcum powder litigation. Yeah, that affects Black and Hispanic women more than anybody else. And it was intentional. And so we have to speak truth to power when you have these corporations who intentionally preyed on us because they said, no, we don't matter. Nobody cares. Well, if we don't care about Black lives, then who's going to care? And we can't just get upset when it's the police shooting us. It has to be when the corporations are killing us too, and we sit idly by and we don't say a word. And so, you know, when I talk to these corporations, I always try to be friendly, Charles and Jerry and Tara, but my Lord, we always have a real conversation, because I was taught by Professor Naeem Akbar at Florida State University, a great African-American psychologist. He said, if you sit down with your oppressor and you all walk out and it doesn't feel somewhat uncomfortable, then you weren't actually being honest, were you? Think about that.
Man, you dropping nuggets from the Image Awards, from college sociology class. How we go? You want to go after him, Miss John? That's where I was going next. But look, in your corporation, one of the things that I pulled up is that you have 3 pillars of your DEI, and this ties directly in with what Mr. Crump and Ben was just talking about. That is talent, culture, and communities. And so I want to ask you quite specifically some of the things over the past year where Black employees sometimes, especially after watching George Floyd, like they come to work and they just don't want to deal with white folk today. Like, you have these moments and the feeling is palpable. You see each other in the break room and you just like, you just nod your head. What have you been doing when you talk about culture and communities internally to help your Black employees, not just elevate them, and not just survive? I think one of the things that we got to stop talking about in Black communities, to Ms. DeVard's point, is we got to stop talking about surviving. I mean, I know that comes from my mom and my grandmama's church, but I want to start talking about thriving. How are you talking to your Black employees, and particularly in creating an internal culture where you can help them thrive in moments of intense and immense pressure with COVID and in light of George Floyd?
So thanks, Bakari. Great question. I think, and I'm going to build on something that both Charles and Jerry said earlier. And one of the first things that we did is we gave our employees a space to have conversation. So from a culture perspective, we've been hosting a lot of courageous conversations. We're hosting days of understanding to give our employees the freedom to be authentic, to talk about how they're feeling, and being open and having conversations that we likely haven't had across the organization in a number of years, if at all. And Manulife has a global footprint. And so we've been doing that across every market in which we operate. And so we felt it obviously very uniquely across the US, but it was felt across Canada. And I could say that personally, the experiences that I had and what I shared with colleagues and across Asia too. And so we're allowing our employees and our leaders to get underneath and not just stay at the superficial level, and let's have some really heart-to-heart open conversations. And so there's been a significant investment on top of the days of understanding and the deep conversations that we're having to develop learning programs to support all leaders to have better awareness as they think about DEI and what does that mean to them as leaders and how they need to create space and for their employees, particularly their Black employees. We've also been doing an opening learning more broadly across the organization. And so we know that it's a journey. We know that we need to create the climate for employees to feel comfortable. And so this is not a one and done. So we've made, like many companies, we announced our financial commitment, and that's tied to, as you mentioned, our talent, culture, and community. And on the community side, we have done significant investments, but to your point, it's not about writing a check. It is about writing a check to what end, to drive outcomes, and what are the organizations that we know that we can have a significant impact and that will drive and is in alignment with the goals that we've achieved and that we've set for ourselves, but definitely not have achieved yet. So if I think about, we're a signatory across for Black North, which exists in Canada, to raise the representation of Blacks and senior and people of color and senior level roles across all organizations on boards. We're a signatory for the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion across the US. And so it aligns to the public commitments that we've been making. And we're also spending time, again, from a community perspective, at looking at our supplier governance process. And I know you talked about this earlier, Charles talked about this earlier. How do we think about the partners and have conversation with our vendors and get underneath what are they actually doing specifically as it relates to DEI, and asking those difficult questions to make sure that what they're driving aligns to where our commitments that we're making, and thinking about if they can articulate it, are they businesses that we want to continue to partner with in the future? But I would say on a whole, our employees are feeling more open and more comfortable to have the conversation, but they know it's not enough. They want to see the movement. They want to see the representation. They want to see people that look like them at senior levels of the organization. And so we're being way more transparent in terms of what our goals are and what our representation would be at various levels across the organization to support the conversations that we're having and show some of the proof points.
Can I jump in real quick, Bakari, for 1 second?
Please
I
do.
thought it was so deep what Tara just said, because that's the other power that corporations have. And we find that when I was president of the National Bar Association, you have to applaud those corporations when they go hire for services. They say, well, how diverse is your law firm? Do you have Black partners? Do you have Hispanic partners? The accounting firms, whether they cleaning the building, I mean, it's so many ways to be able to empower Black people just by asking the questions. And those are some of the things we talk about in these conversations when the corporations invite us.
Go ahead, Mr. Var.
And I also wanted to say there is power in the question, and we have more power than we use. And a lot of then what you were talking about earlier is, I think, is fear driven. People don't speak up because there is fear and fear of what's going to happen to me and what's in it for me. And I also think too, when you think about, I always say there should be a 12-step program, for racial reckoning. It's from the first step is acknowledgement, the 12th step is reparations. But, there's a lot in the middle of that before you get there. But also too, I don't want to minimize this idea of just writing a check. Writing a check is important, right? I mean, Black enterprise needs advertisers, because Black enterprise is putting the message out there, sponsoring things like this with, the ELC and other organizations to get all of you, all of your points of view out there and heard. And so you need organizations to understand that, yes, they have to, have an acknowledgement of what the issue is, be committed to making a change, being very honest with themselves. That's what I talked about, those diversity audits. What is our representation? What is it at every level? What is it by gender? Don't just talk about minorities, break that out and talk about Black and Hispanic and, and women and Asian. And so I think all of that has a place, but also writing a check allows organizations, charitable organizations, to really mobilize people to create change, because you're not going to be able to do that just by, wanting to make it happen.
I actually just want to say thank you all for the role that you all play. Ms. John made me just think, when she was talking about some of the things that they were doing, about how the only reason, one of the real reasons outside of Darnella Frazier, who actually had the strength to carry the camera, but we also had Black folk throughout the diaspora around the world who came out into the streets. And that's the real reason that we saw justice for George Floyd. Darnella Frazier, it only took Darnella Frazier, a 17-year-old Black girl, and a worldwide unrest for us to get progress, but we will take it, okay? So in your last 30 seconds or so, 30 seconds, Ben. If
George Floyd being tortured to death, though.
On camera, I know. Your last 30 seconds, just give your observations over the last year and answer just this kind of small question of where do we go from here? And I'll start with you, Charles.
The number of people stepping up and taking public positions, this didn't happen 15 years ago. I just think people are more, for whatever reason, have the courage now to jump out there at personal risk and say some things that maybe they wouldn't have said 15 years ago. So I'm very encouraged. I know we have all our issues and we're not where we want to be, but the progress and the fact that people are paying attention and more Black people are speaking up, I'm optimistic that things will get better. So I just want to thank Ben and Jerry and Tara for all you're doing out there, because I see it all, and you guys are heroes to a lot of people.
Mr. Var?
I can't say it any better than what Charles said. I mean, I started off by saying that I felt that we've made progress. I'm hopeful. I have no other way to be but hopeful, because if I'm not hopeful, then I believe that nothing can change. But I think that old adage, if not me, who? If not now, when? Still exists. And we need to be able to hold ourselves accountable for making our little small dent into the universe of creating change for diversity and representation.
Ms. John?
I would agree. The only thing I would add is I too am hopeful, so you're not going to get an argument from me, Jerry. But with respect to Black people being comfortable in having their voice and having their voice at work and in public places, but also I feel hopeful that our allies are truly stepping up and doing more than just talking. They realize that they're committed and they're part of this change.
And Mr. Crump.
Because I just want to thank you for a very engaging panel.
Yes, yes.
You're brilliant as always, brother. And I think we should absolutely use this moment to continue to have these conversations. Some people will call them uncomfortable conversations, but we should always articulate it as an important conversation. Nobody wants to do anything uncomfortable, but everybody wants to do something important. And so we have these important conversations to talk about all of our children having an equal opportunity at life and liberty in the pursuit of happiness. And Bakari, that's always the most important thing, the pursuit of happiness when we talk about corporate America, because that leads us into business. Isn't that what the pursuit of happiness has always been for Americans to have this opportunity to achieve the American dream? So I thank Black Enterprise. I always learn from Charles and Jerry, Tara. So nice meeting you. Charles, I can never say thank you enough for coming to Minneapolis, brother.
Yeah, we came out there, by the way, some business people, myself, Raymond Guarin, and Al Sharpton went out for the trial, and Ben was gracious and hosted us. And we just wanted to show solidarity that business and political people and lawyers, we can all come together in the Black community.
You know, I knew that occurred, and I didn't want to mention it unless you two mentioned it. I was going to throw that out there, but I think that, you know, a lot of the work that you all do and a lot of the work that Black execs do, we always ask for more, but a lot of times we don't know the bigness to make up a word of your heart and your efforts behind the scenes. And we know some of those things have been done. So thank you. Everybody joining us today is joining us not because we believe anything about this country is irredeemable. In fact, we just want to reimagine what she looks like and reimagine a country that is safe for all of our children so they can grow up. And as Ben says, that they can have not just the pursuit of happiness, but life, liberty, justice, peace, all those words that may not be so tangible, but we want young Black children particularly to be able to grasp onto those things as well. I'm from the big city of Denmark, South Carolina. My mom and dad would always tell me the three most important words in the English language are the words thank you, and they're not nearly said enough. And thank you to all my panelists tonight. Thank you most importantly to Black Enterprise for bringing this August collection of individuals together. Please support Black Enterprise, y'all. We need it here. We need it to survive. Like the old gospel song says. And so thank you for everyone. Special thank you to our producers tonight, Genevieve Bryant, Ken Meeks, Derek Dingle, and everybody who worked very hard to make sure that we would be comfortable and put on a great town hall series. Look for the next episode of the Black Enterprise Town Hall series. My name is Bakari Sellers. And again, thank you for joining us today.
Good evening. I'm Mike Heider, President and CEO of the Executive Leadership Council, and I'm proud to lead an organization focused on amplifying the needs of Black executives across the globe, advocating for their representation in the world's leading corporations, and developing the next generation of Black business leaders. Tonight's conversation was riveting, and I thank all of our speakers for contributing their thought leadership to such an emotional but critical discussion for all Black Americans. I can't think of another platform to foster this kind of candid dialogue about the Black community. That's why we're proud to partner with Black Enterprise to sponsor not just one or two discussions, but the entire Black Enterprise Economic Equity and Racial Justice Town Hall series. Partnering with the leading publication dedicated to advancing Black business leadership and championing efforts to increase the number of Black executives in the C-suite and on corporate boards, together, we will lead a national dialogue on social, economic inequities and racial justice issues that continue to plague our community. In this series, we will seek to advance strategies to elevate the state of the Black community and make sure that corporate America remains accountable for fulfilling their diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. We'll also welcome national thought leaders into these important discussions, approaching each conversation through a Black business lens. As part of our annual Gala Week programming, the ELC will host the October 12th Town Hall session on education. We'll also host the session on wealth creation and achieving parity in capital on January 13th, 2022. Our members at the ELC are already buzzing about this series, and we're looking forward to discussing some of the most critical topics in the Black business community today. I want to extend a very special thank you to Butch Graves Jr. and the entire Black Enterprise team for this groundbreaking opportunity to support Black Enterprise and elevate the voices of the Black business community. So stay tuned. We look forward to seeing you again for our next conversation.
Thank you, Michael. I'm Alfred Edmond Jr., SVP and Executive Editor at Large at Black Enterprise, the #1 Black digital media company with more than 8 million unique visitors. Thank you for joining us today for the Black Enterprise Economic Equity and Racial Justice Town Hall. Be sure to join us for upcoming Town Hall Series events addressing the following critical issues and topics: voter suppression, how Black business leadership will preserve and protect our franchise; home ownership and wealth building, creating pathways to lasting Black prosperity; education, ensuring that no Black child will be left behind; Black women gaining a seat at the table; Black business development, achieving parity in capital and contracts; and finally, criminal justice reform, developing a fair and equitable system for all. Learn more at blackenterprise.com.